I called this meeting. I had Daddy ask you all to come over so I could tell you what I had to tell Fonny today. What I had to tell Fonny today is Fonny's gonna be a father. We're gonna have a baby.
You and me, we fixing to go out and get drunk. All right. Oh, I'm glad. Don't worry, I'm mighty glad.
And who's gonna be responsible for this baby?
The father and the mother.
And that is a clip from If Beale Street Could Talk. Its writer and director is Barry Jenkins, and he's back on the show. Hello, Barry. How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
It's very nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too, my friend.
I only see you when there's excitement in the air, because the last time we saw you was a couple of years ago, just before the Oscars. That kind of worked out quite well for you.
Yeah, I need to put a picture of you on my fridge, clearly.
That's right. So Beale Street gets Best Adapted Screenplay, so that's you. Best Supporting Actress, that's not you, that's Regina King, and Best Original Score. So as we're speaking now, that came out yesterday. When these things happen, are you pinned to the wires? Do you wait for the phone call? Do you go out for a walk? Do you not pay attention? How does that work out?
I go out for a walk, especially this time. I typically tend to be in foreign countries when the announcement is made, so it's not 5 in the morning for me. It's usually like 2 or 1 in the afternoon. So it was lunchtime. So I went out for a walk to get a cup of coffee. And my publicist, she did this with both Moonlight and Beale Street. She'll just write little notes on hotel stationery and slip them under the door. And that's how I come back into the room and find out, rather than watching it live. It's just too much to watch it live.
So you came back into your hotel. Is it one slip of paper for each nomination?
So it was interesting. For Moonlight, she did them all on one sheet of paper. But on this one, she did an individual buck slip for each piece of paper.
Did you know what those ones would be, do you think, if you'd had to guess what the 3 would be?
Yeah. If I had to guess, I would have known what the 3 would have been. With all the stuff with the awards season, eventually it kind of reveals itself. And by the time you get to this stage, that's maybe like 20% of the nominations or surprises. So, yeah, it pretty much aligned with my expectations.
Okay. So the movie starts with words coming up on the screen explaining Beale Street and the concept of Beale Street. Can you just do a radio version of that?
Beale Street is kind of a metaphor for any place, particularly in America, but I think all over the world, where Black people have found a way to build enclaves, build families, communities, to live life. And I think there's a Beale Street, as the opening quote from Mr. Baldwin says, in Memphis, Tennessee, in Harlem, New York, in Jackson, Mississippi. And I think that if you retitled the film Moonlight, If Beale Street Could Talk, it would be the same film, because it's another depiction of Black life, in one of these communities.
So this is a book from 1974. Mm-hmm. Explain how this ended up as your next project after Moonlight. There must have been a lot of competing projects in there. How come you've ended up with the James Baldwin novel?
Yeah, there were a lot of competing projects after Moonlight, especially after how loudly the Academy Awards ended for that film. But in the summer of 2013, I took a trip to Europe and I wrote 2 screenplays. One of those was Moonlight and the other was adaptation of this novel by James Baldwin, If Beale Street Could Talk. And you have a bucket list as a creative. And, my bucket list was very small. I wanted to make a movie about where I was from. That was Moonlight. And I also wanted to make a movie adapting my favorite author, which was James Baldwin. And so when I read this book for the first time around 2010, 2011, I just fell in love with this idea of taking a love story, but also speaking about some very real things about American society.
When you say you took a trip to Europe, where did you go and why did you choose there?
So I bought a round trip ticket to Brussels, Belgium, and my intention was to be there for the entire 6 weeks I was in Europe. But I started writing Moonlight, just not unexpectedly, but I thought I was there to adapt this novel by Baldwin. I wasn't there to really write Moonlight, but I just started writing. And 10 days later, I was done with that script. And Brussels was a very lovely place, but I wanted to see more of Europe, and I'd never been to Berlin. So I took a train to Berlin, and that's where I adapted If Beale Street Could Talk.
Maybe if you could just explain what the story is of Beale Street, because at its heart it's quite simple, although it's a very complex and multi-layered film, but at the heart of it?
At the heart of If Beale Street Could Talk, it's a love story about a young couple, Tish and Fonny, who were just beginning their lives when the justice system, the legal system, when a rogue police officer frames Fonny for a crime he did not commit.
So it's kind of a timeless story, even though this is Harlem in the 1970s. Is that period quite important? Could it be set now?
I think it could be set now. The period is important to contextualize what the characters are going through, but I think the power of James Baldwin, the reason why we wanted to allow the film to remain set in the early 1970s, is to show how some of these problems Mr. Baldwin is talking about have been allowed to persist. And so it's a contemporary story, I think, in a certain way, but we allowed it to remain set in the period.
I've seen it twice, and the second time,
Oh, thank
people
you.
I was watching it with said, at the end of it, said, when was that set?
Mm-hmm.
Because I was just picking up on the fact you said timeless, even though it is set in the 70s. At the end of it, you think it didn't feel like a 70s movie.
Yeah. It's
particularly.
interesting. There's a few things going on. One is the movie's told through the perspective of our main character Tish, and she's remembering. It's a series of memories ultimately, so it's not grounded in any documentary kind of framework. And she's thinking of things, from 6 months ago, from 6 years ago, from 6 days ago, and so time is very slippery in the film. But really, even more than that, it's more an impressionistic approach to time. And so this young girl is remembering, this 19-year-old girl, the most vibrant moments in her life, and those things are overtly lush. They're almost operatic in their beauty. And when we think of America and the purest time, in American history, at least for the last half century, it's not the 1960s or 70s. It's this 1950s, the post-World War II, the economic boom and like the really big sweeping Hollywood melodramas. And I think in a certain way, the notion of grounding exactly when the story takes place is a little bit difficult for an audience because I think, one, time is related in a very slippery way, but the feeling of what Tish is feeling is somehow it goes to the early 60s to late 50s in a certain way, and then very aggressively to the early 70s when you get into the more police sort of brutality elements of the film.
If the story and the narrative is slippery, does that make it a difficult adaptation?
Yes, of course. And I think also, too, when you're dealing with James Baldwin, who was his obsession was with the interior life of characters. I mean, not necessarily like what happens, but what it feels like as things happen, the spirituality, at the heart of the characters. That, and of course, this idea of nonlinear storytelling was quite challenging. Cinema is not the best medium for interiority, and yet we're trying to translate this author who's speaking about some very real things, but speaking about them in an almost ethereal way. Yeah, it was the most challenging thing I've ever done in my life.
Were you helped at all by this somewhat surprising package that you got sent from, as I understand it, James Baldwin's sister, with some notes that he'd made about a film adaptation of this story?
Yeah, I was helped somewhat by the notebook that mysteriously appeared on my doorstep.
I was thinking maybe it could be a hindrance as well.
Yeah, exactly. It could have been a hindrance, except, when I opened it, I had already written, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 drafts of the script at that point. So it had taken shape. And maybe they waited to send me this package until the script had taken shape because they didn't want to scare me. But it was just a confirmation that many of the choices we had made in adapting the book, Mr. Baldwin was prepared to make himself because he was attempting to write the screenplay himself back in 1978. And so it was a really cool package to receive. It had a list of directors that Mr. Baldwin was considering to direct the adaptation, and they were Francois Truffaut, Louis Malle, Gordon Parks, and Lloyd Richards. And now this guy, Barry Jenkins, comes along.
Who wasn't even born then.
Who wasn't even born then, exactly. I was 1 year away from being born.
You've said it's a love story. You have Tish and Fanny there right at the heart of the story. You expect a lot of them, don't you? Because it's not just a love story, but until people have seen it, they might not get what we're talking about here. But they are, in the very real sense, soulmates.
Yes.
And despite everything that happens to them, there is a quietness and a calmness about them and about their relationship, which you might not expect in another movie. Can you just explain a bit about what you were expecting from them and what you said to them?
Yeah, to me, the strength of the book, or the backbone of the book, is this belief that Tish and Fanny are soulmates. And, over the course of a 20-hour read, that's something that's allowed to really soak into the reader. But I think when you watch a feature film, there's a very short amount of time. It's 2 hours. You have to be able to viscerally see that these two characters are soulmates. And so, for Kiki and Stefan, who play Tish and Fanny, I think they understood that. I think also, too, this idea of love being this thing that is almost, it's not tangible. You can't go to the bank and get a loan on a house with love, and yet it's also the one thing that truly, I think can protect us, can sustain us through these very difficult moments in our lives. And so that's a very intellectual or emotional thing. It's not something you can see and hear. And yet through Stefan James and Kiki Lane, I felt like my task was to allow the audience to see and feel this idea of two people as soulmates, And I think then using that seeing and feeling, and I know you're right, this does sound strange to say it out loud, to use that seeing and feeling the essence of what it's like to be a soulmate, to understand just how people somehow withstand and endure through these very real injustices that they must face.
Because some of the interior life that you were talking about that's in the book we get from narration.
Exactly.
But you presumably we get the rest of it from their faces and the way their eyes are acting. We see a lot of their eyes, and they do the look to the camera a lot, so they're looking at us. That's what you're expecting us to pick up from that.
It is. I think that cinema is a very, they say it's a tool for empathy. It's an empathy machine. And I think sometimes the best way to most directly take passive empathy and make it active empathy is to not necessarily force the audience to walk a mile in the character's shoes, but to allow the audience to actually put on those shoes. That's why we do these direct-to-camera moments where the actors are looking at each other, but now they're looking directly at the audience in a certain way. Acting is giving and receiving. One of my actors told me, and when you're acting with the scene partner, you give, and they receive, they give back. When you're acting directly to camera, you give, and nobody's there to receive it until you're sitting in an auditorium, and now this actor/character is looking directly at you, and now you receive directly, and theoretically, you give something back. In a very visceral way. So I think to me, and also to Regina King is nominated for Best Supporting Actress. You mentioned it at the top. And there's a 3-minute stretch of this film where the main characters disappear, and it's just Regina King. There's in a single line of dialogue for the first 3 minutes. She's in Puerto Rico, and it's all just body and soul. It's eye contact with the audience, and you really get to feel what this woman is going through.
So there's the love story at the heart of the film, but it's also polemic, and there is an injustice which happens. But the film isn't. I don't think it's an angry film. Presumably, you had to be careful that the polemic doesn't overwhelm the love story, but the love story doesn't overwhelm the kind of injustice which happens.
Exactly. And I think the power. I think what makes the story a tragedy ultimately is how pure this love story is, and how in certain moments how clearly rendered it is. And yet you're right, the polemical aspects of the story are always threatening that love. To me, those things go hand in hand. The balance of the parody you're talking about, it was something that I was very diligent about being aware of. And what I had to do was step back, and I never do this. We often talk about how metrics are ruining the film industry, or metrics are dictating what the audience actually receives at the Cinemaplex. But I had to use a metric approach to balancing the love and the polemic in a certain way. And what I understood was I had to think of it like chemistry. Certain elements have denser properties than others, and so you need less of them to arrive at parity. So I felt like this idea of trying to find a balance between the love story, the romance, and the more systemic injustice, the polemic, that was the most challenging task.
I mentioned Best Original Score, Oscar nomination for that. This is Nicholas Britell's work. At what stage did that enter your head? Did he join afterwards? Could you hear it as you were filming? How did that work with this?
No, I knew I was going to work with Nick immediately after finishing Moonlight, so I gave him the script. And Nick is really good about, he'll start writing music to the script. He's really lovely in that way. I give him a direction and he sets off on it. And for this film, it was all about jazz, about brass, saxophone, trumpet, things like that. And so Nick started writing for those things. But what I love about Nick, and I say this a lot, and I mean it as a compliment, not in the pejorative, but the film could exist without Nick's music, but Nick's music cannot exist without the film. I say that because he's always writing to extend or amplify what the characters are feeling. And so the characters always have to come first. And so I don't have the music in my head as we're filming, but once we're in post and we're editing, organically, as the characters evolve, as the film evolves, Nick's music evolves as well.
When we spoke to you a couple of years ago about Moonlight, one of the projects I was interested in mentioning was Underground Railroad, which is this extraordinary book from a couple of years back by Colson White. I just thought it was one of the most astonishing books I've ever read, and how exciting that it's you directing this. Now, this is a TV project, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a limited series at Amazon. We're doing it over the course of 10 hours. It just felt like Cora's story, the heroine at the center of the Underground Railroad, demanded 10 hours because I wanted to see the full spectrum of her experience.
Come on, tease us a little bit more.
No.
What stage?
So we're writing the scripts, we're location scouting, we're casting. It's probably why I'm not getting as much sleep these days as I should. But when I first read the novel, I was blown away by it because it reminded me of being a kid a certain way. When you first hear about the Underground Railroad, especially as a young African-American boy, you imagine black people with trains underground. And then almost like learning about Santa Claus, you learn, oh, well, actually, it was a bunch of people, running around at night, going from house to house. Still extraordinary. But this idea of black people having superpowers and hiding trains underground, that was taken away from me. And now through Colson Whitehead, that's been gifted back to me. I almost feel like a kid again. And so even though it's a very heavy story dealing with some very real things, there's also this almost like superhuman, like almost like a comic book element to it because black people have built underground trains that are running people to freedom. And I just think it's one of those things where, again, it's very serious subject matter, but there's something about it that reminds me of being a kid.
Looking forward to that very much. Barry Jenkins, thank you very much, Steve, for coming in, and good luck at the Oscars, and I hope it's incident-free,
Thank you very much. I assume it will be.